Saurabh, and a very warm Shall Express. Today we have with us Mr. Vinod Ganesan, who's the country manager for Cloudera. Thank you so much, Mr. Ganesan, for joining us today.
Thank you, Saurabh, and good afternoon to everyone.
So what has changed in the last 2 years? On the upside, digital transformation has come closer to reality. What is your view of the transformation Indian organizations have witnessed? And where are they placed in the growth curve today?
I couldn't agree more, Saurabh. Actually, if you look at it over the last 2 years, I think the sheer amount of transformations that have happened, if I can put it in the form of a quote that was said by Satya Nadella, I think he said what the country or the world witnessed in 2 weeks or 2 months of time. Uh, we have not witnessed something like that over the last few years, right? So that explains the whole momentum towards the digital transformation journey. And needless to say, I think all of it was induced and driven by the pandemic, right? Now, it's been almost 2 years we've been surviving in the pandemic world, and we've also made a good amount of recovery. And especially when you look at organizations now, uh, we do see a lot of interesting perspectives coming out. So back in November 2021, Cloudera actually came out with our enterprise digital data maturity report, right? And the whole purpose of that exercise was to really look at how do organizations, correlate their enterprise data strategy with the kind of business outcomes or success that they're driving in the marketplace, right? So we found some very interesting observations. One, of course, there was a unanimous uh, agreement by a lot of IT as well as business decision makers that the pandemic has actually moved them to really adopt the public cloud. And largely that was because they had to now start provisioning for a new kind of work culture, which was driven by making provisions for remote workplace, which means now you had to provision your applications. You had to make sure people have access to the productivity tools that they have, and public cloud became the center stage of that. Now, 51% of those respondents clearly believe that their employees would continue to work remotely even after in the coming years, right? And that's what is causing the shift towards organization making a lot of investments in infrastructure towards a hybrid cloud strategy because they have to support both models of the culture. So that's been one of the key. At the same time, in this whole journey, I think one thing that's very clearly coming out is for companies to be successful in this, data-driven journey. It's extremely important for them to have the capability to manage the data across its entire life cycle. So, irrespective of wherever the data resides, whether it's within the enterprise or whether it's on the public cloud or whether it's a combination of the two, it's a very, very critical capability that organizations have to acquire in terms of making sense of the data and the ability to manage it irrespective of wherever the data lies. So that came as one of the key differentiators. The third aspect that organizations are now talking about, which is kind of fueling the hybrid momentum, is this whole increased regulatory framework that's being imposed on them, right? If you look at the Indian landscape, I think we've also come up with our own data privacy bill now that requires the organizations to really uh, look at the way that they are managing data so that whenever you're doing a campaign, there's a customer consent. If you are dealing with personally identifiable information, you need to take care that all of that is protected and only the right people need to have access to that particular data. So how do you now enable this whole centralized governance security policy across the entire data lifecycle is a very, very key capability that organizations need to look at. So I think all of these trends are, pushing organizations more and more to look at a hybrid cloud strategy that allows them not only to take the advantage of the agility that the public cloud has to offer, but also at the same time make very prudent decisions in terms of how they want to deal with sensitive data, whether it makes sense to keep that on-prem, and how do you want to use the infinite scale and resources that the public cloud is providing by leveraging it at the time when they really require the workloads to scale. So that's the trend that we are looking at.
Clearly, the role of companies like Cloudera has never been more important. How has this transformation journey changed the expectations from cloud partners such as yourself?
Well, absolutely. I think I would say, you know, as a company, we've always been founded on the principle that data makes what looks impossible today possible tomorrow. And I think with the whole advent of cloud becoming mainstream, the responsibility only gets bigger for companies like us, right? Now, uh, what are some of the challenges that we see in this journey, which is kind of really helping us fuel our innovation, right? So, multi cloud today is becoming a very, very clear choice for a lot of organizations because they don't want to get locked with one specific cloud service provider. Now, if you really look at some of the trends, I mean, during the pandemic, a lot of us witnessed that even the cloud services were down and a lot of organizations faced outage, right? Now imagine if you are highly leveraged with a particular provider and you experience a downtime, you are literally betting your business for on an event like this, right? So increasingly, multi-cloud is becoming more and more a preference for companies so that they can reduce their cloud concentration risk. However, with that specification, the biggest challenge is how do you adopt that without the need for you to rewrite your applications every time you make the switch between heterogeneous cloud service providers, right? So that is something that brings in a bigger technical debt in a customer's data architecture, and they wouldn't want to do that. They need the agility, but they would want to move seamlessly. So I think that's where Cloudera brings in one of the biggest value proposition, which is the whole multi-cloud support, where you write your enterprise applications once, and then you have the ability to run it across the public cloud of your choice. Right? The second aspect is not all workloads are necessarily cheaper to run on the public cloud. You could have certain workloads which really makes economic sense to run on-prem, or there could be certain workloads where your sheer security and governance policies do not allow to put, move them to the public cloud. So you also now need to have the ability to run these workloads hybrid while running some of the workloads on public, right? And when you move these workloads seamlessly, uh, you should always be able to make sure that you are not violating any of your enterprise's security and governance policy that has been laid down. Right? And that's where, again, uh, Cloudera worked hard on our enterprise data cloud platform to provide that consistent layer of security and governance for our customers so that they can run the workloads wherever they choose to without worrying about violating any of these principles. The third aspect is when you look at the whole analytical journey, you are actually your data is moving through a life cycle, right? So, for example, you bring in data from various sources, then you kind of cleanse that, you tag it appropriately, and you curate it, and then provide it to a downstream data warehouse experience on what where you would typically run your analytical workloads, or you may want to provision it to an operational database where you are serving business users for a particular business outcome. And at the same time, the same data now needs to be provisioned to your data science and machine learning teams so that they are able to now use this data to train models that allows them to, make draw a lot of valuable insights and again the ability to make or use these recommendations that are coming and apply it back on the edge. So when you look at this whole end-to-end process, the data is moving across the entire life cycle, and you need to now have the ability to manage the data across the life cycle. Many organizations, went ahead and adopted point solutions, which resulted in them building a lot of silos, right? And unfortunately, once these silos are built, it's very difficult for you to integrate the solutions and have a consistent view. So eventually, the integration tax is borne by the customer. Now, when here Cloudera has helped the customers alleviate all these concerns by providing them the enterprise data cloud platform that provides the whole end-to-end data lifecycle experience, right? So it's an integrated end-to-end multifunctional platform. And last but not the least, when you are looking at these strategies, you don't want to get locked down to any sort of proprietary technologies, because increasingly people are investing in architectures which allow a lot of collaboration, not only within the organization, but also you need to integrate your downstream suppliers, vendors, partner ecosystem. So, which means these whole platform should be extensible in terms of open APIs and the way they interact with each other. Now, since we come with a very strong pedigree of open source, our entire platform that we offer today is built on this principle, and it is open. So the way we have evolved is we are now providing an enterprise data cloud platform that allows you with a multi and hybrid cloud support, that allows you to manage the end-to-end data life cycle across all these experiences, that allows you to implement a single layer of security and governance across those multi-cloud and multifunctional manifestations, and last but not least, built completely using the open source technology.
Absolutely no doubts in saying that hybrid cloud is the future, and it's here now. But do you want to really tell us how it can help enterprises take that leap forward?
Like I mentioned before, when you look at cloud, clearly make no mistake, cloud is an enabler and it provides agility. Unfortunately, a lot of customers still view cloud as another data center that's available to them to run workloads. I think cloud is much more than that. Today, if you look at it, a lot of your, based on the type of business and the opportunities that is available in the marketplace, a lot of your data sources itself are natively available on the cloud, right? So which means if you can take advantage of integrating these sources into your mainstream enterprise, you are able to bring in far more value and enrich your enterprise data. So that gives you the ability to kind of go and start embracing the cloud and start, bringing out the value that it has to offer. Very clearly, on top of that, when you start doing analytics or when you start bringing in disciplines like AI and machine learning, I think that allows you to draw a lot of insights onto the data that you've already assimilated. So that's the biggest value driver that cloud actually unlocks. So it's the agility that it enables for organizations to drive business-driven outcomes. Hybrid, as I mentioned earlier, there are benefits of having a flexible architecture that does not necessarily mean that everything has to run on a public cloud. So you take efficiencies of scale, you based on the sensitivity of data that you are dealing with, you could make a choice in terms of where you want to run some of those applications. But most importantly, you should be able to enforce a consistent layer of security and governance and lineage, because that is something that cannot be compromised at all, right? So that's the biggest value that hybrid cloud enables for our customers, right? And in today's world, given the sort of market opportunities that are coming up, the window for organizations to really capitalize on those opportunities is very, very small. Now, if there is no readiness there, and if you have a very traditional setup which doesn't allow you to go and tap that particular opportunity, you are lagging behind your competitors. So I think that's one of the biggest drivers today, where it's no longer just about the cost, it's also about how do you kind of leapfrog your competitors and how do you take advantage of the market opportunities to move forward in your entrepreneurial data-driven journey.
So, what are the kind of sectors, the key sectors that Cloudera is currently focused on? Approach you're taking to empower players in these sectors?
Because we are dealing with data, and practically every business in this planet generates data, we are fortunate to be of relevance to possibly every sector that you could think of. We do extremely well with the regulated sectors, especially if you look at it like finance and telco. 8 out of the top world top banks runs Cloudera. 10 out of the top 10 telcos across the world runs on Cloudera. And largely this is because, like I said before, these are very tightly regulated industry where while they have to drive those data-driven outcomes, they also need to make sure that their compliance is never breached, right? And that's the value that we provide for these organizations, where using that layer of security governance that I spoke about earlier, they are able to confidently undertake a lot of data-driven projects without worrying about the need to change the underlying architecture every time the regulations change. So there we are doing well. Uh, Here again, if you see, there is this proliferation of real-time use cases that is coming now, right? So when you look at, for example, financial services or a bank, the whole parlance of fraud or the way you respond to a customer in terms of helping him choose the next best offer, all of these are real-time events, and you need to have the capability to analyze the data as the transaction is being done and then make that recommendation in terms of either allowing that transaction to happen or flagging it out as a fraud, and or by making that important recommendation to the customer based on the exact point in time transaction that he's doing. So that's something that we enable really well for financial services. On the manufacturing side, I think the key technology that underpins the data landscape is also IoT, because they have their plants and machineries which is churning a lot of data. And for them, it's all about how do I optimize my existing processes? How do I improve my quality so that I am able to kind of get into those predictive, prescriptive maintenance kind of use cases, right? Now that requires you to, again, not only have real time, but also deal with IoT data. And that's huge in terms of the scale. So typical characteristic of big data, where we talk about all the 5 V's in terms of the volume, velocity, veracity, variety, value. All these ingredients are present in these enterprises. So here again, because we have the ability to scale, provide that infinite scale, and also help customers embrace the whole real-time sales motion, which we call as the data in pipeline architecture. That's something that we really do well for the manufacturing segment. So I think all in all, we kind of touch upon all the segments typically who are dealing or generating data, and we bring in a lot of value to each one of them, which is very specific in terms of the area that they are doing.
What are some of the key trends that you foresee at Cloudera that will drive the adoption of hybrid cloud in the coming years?
I think it's all about how do you take more and more open source components, because that has been our biggest pedigree, like I alluded before, right? So how do you take relevant projects? Our biggest advantage is we work very closely with the open source community. So we are able to track what kind of innovations are happening in that community. And Cloudera not only embraces some of these projects based on the kind of key trends or the kind of outcomes that they are designed to drive, but we also contribute back in terms of enhancing some of the capabilities within these projects that the community is struggling for. So I think that's a very big plus that I believe, or a value that we unlock for our customers in terms of making sure that we are always able to bring in the latest trends into the platform. So it's a platform that is evolving constantly based on the needs and the maturity of the technology. So that's one big outcome that we strive for at Cloudera. And in the end, if you really look at it, I think the biggest roadblock that most organizations face in their data-driven journey is silo. Earlier, through the project-based driving, buying behavior, right? All the silos were accumulated on-prem. Today, when people are moving to the public cloud, unfortunately, again, they are just kind of picking point solutions that solves a particular problem which is relevant to them, or which is a burning problem in that enterprise's context. So they will buy point solution A, point solution B, and in no time, you would have accumulated silos again on the public cloud. So what have you done? You moved your silos from on-prem to public cloud. Now that's silo is what creates the biggest bottleneck in terms of how do you manage data. And Cloudera, thankfully, is working to make sure that we are able to break down all these silos and provide a unified platform that allows customers to manage the whole end-to-end data lifecycle experience. So I think we'll continue to deliver more and more on those aspects so that we are able to add value. The third aspect that we are working on is around observability, because as the technology stack becomes complex, our customers are looking at more and more capabilities in terms of how do I manage the whole underlying platform? What kind of insights do I have in terms of the workloads that are running? How I can utilize that insights to drive much more efficiency. If we have to support that business ask, we have to build or tighten the observability layer. And that's something that we have already enabled through the workload manager that comes integrated as a part of the platform. And we'll continue to add more and more features in that direction. So all in all, I think these are some of the design goals that we are working on to make sure that we continue to drive value for our customers and make it easier for them to adopt a hybrid approach.
As you rightly mentioned, it's an evolving landscape. Scale is one challenge, but perhaps an even bigger challenge is what are some of the best practices that companies, enterprise should follow as per you to sort of safeguard themselves in this evolving landscape, which also brings along a lot of challenges on security, targeted attacks, and all those things.
So, Saurav, apologies, I missed the main line. You said apart from scale, what is the big challenge?
So scale is one challenge, but the bigger challenge is privacy and security. And as these attacks become more and more sophisticated and targeted, there are some best practices that enterprises would really want to know, from companies like yourself that they should follow to sort of safeguard themselves going forward. So what are some of these best practices according to you?
I think that's a pretty important point. Like you rightly said, scale today is given. Organization invest in any technology with the underlying premise that it is scalable. On the security side, I think there are a lot of important areas that one needs to consider. Right? Now, you spoke about data privacy or personally identifiable information. When you are looking at a hybrid cloud architecture, clearly one of the biggest capability that you acquire as a part of that is your ability to move data between on-prem and to any public cloud of your choice, or even across multiple clouds. Now the challenge is, think about the scenario where you are dealing with a PII data. You have marked based on your role-based access control systems. You have defined a policy within the organization in terms of who accesses this information. Now, the moment you replicate this data to a public cloud, how to ensure that those properties are retained or those metadata information is also moving. So at Cloudera, we really worked hard on this problem where we said to ourselves that apart from the various other capabilities that customers are looking at, right? You also need to deal with something called as data context, right? Which is nothing but the metadata about the data in terms of what it describes as property. So whenever the data moves, it needs to make sure that the metadata also moves along with it, right? So that, for example, if you have a personally identifiable information and I have the ability now to tag that particular asset as PII. So I just attach a tag called PII to that particular data set. And when the data moves, it moves along with the tag. So even after it has been replicated to a newer location, somebody tries to access it, he will not be able to access that particular information. So how do you move the data along with the context, or how do you provide a always on context? That is something that you should be looking at from an architectural evaluation standpoint. Second, I mentioned that most access control mechanisms of the past were truly around role-based access control, where you define which role had access to what kind of data. Now we have gone a couple of steps further down, drill down, and we are looking at attribute-based access control. So we can go within the data set, and inside the data set, we can decide who has access to what fields, right? So you can really go down to a granular level of attribute-based access control so that you are able to protect the information from misuse. So that becomes the context number 2. Now, in the whole security landscape, I think if you look at largely in India over the last few years, most organizations have already deployed SOC, right? So as a part of the security operations command center, whatever they deployed, they bought in various products that had a whole lot of capabilities, and collectively these solutions allow you to kind of analyze what kind of attacks are happening in the system, how do you respond to that. Now the challenge here is even those architectures are still reactive. I mean, something happens, you analyze, and then you figure out what happened, right? Now regulators are pushing the envelope by saying, hey, it's no longer enough for you to just tell me what happened. You need to have abilities to prevent that kind of an attack. So what does that mean from an architectural standpoint? You literally take all of the enterprise logs that are available across the organization, and let's say you bring it to a data lake, which you may want to call as the security data lake. And now you start building AI ML models, because as a company, for the number of years that you have existed, you know what kind of attacks, what are the patterns, and when something happens, how do you react? Now, using that data, you start training, the models, and over time, you use AI ML to build a framework where instead of responding to the attack, you actually look at trends. If you see certain anomalies or certain patterns moving in a specific direction, you are able to immediately sense that, hey, you know what, this pattern is similar to a DOS attack, and I think if this continues, we could be susceptible. So you kind of shut down that particular access point. So now you moved from being reactive to being absolutely predictive or preventive, right? So that's the shift that's happening on the security side. And these are some of the interesting complements which is being driven through the whole AIML framework that will enhance your existing security systems. Did that make sense, Saurabh?
It does. Very, very insightful, Mr. Vinod. Thank you so much for your time. It was pleasure talking. As I said, very insightful, very informative. I wish you all the best.
Pleasure was mine. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity. I look forward to speak to you again.